Sure. So the Internet Society is an international organization that exists to promote the Internet. We like to say the Internet is for everyone. We've been around for a little over 25 years now, and we work in 23 countries. We've got staff, and we work, of course, in every country of the world, promoting the Internet to try to make sure that people understand the technical facts of the Internet and how that affects the policy options that are available to people. So we work on issues such as community networks, where we're trying to connect the unconnected. We work on issues like the Internet of Things and the security of those systems. We work on routing security, so how the Internet actually works in its plumbing. And we work on questions of how the Internet is governed, the ways in which people try to make the policy frameworks for how to work on the Internet. I mean, first of all, I would say this part of the world, this region, we have a relatively young bureau in the Middle East and North Africa, and it's a tremendous, tremendously growing area. There's a lot of young people here. It's a young population, and there's very unusual patterns of connectivity. So Dubai, for instance, has tremendously high connectivity, mostly via mobile. Other parts of the region have intermittent connectivity, or they have connectivity that works sometimes and not. And so this is an interesting and challenging region for us, and we have some tremendous staff who are working here. So that's the first reason, actually, that I ever go anywhere, is this is an area where we are active and interested. You're right, however, that here in Dubai we have the International Telecommunications Union Plenipotentiary meeting that is going on right now, and we're here to try to inform and educate governments and regulators about how the Internet works and what kinds of roles, regulatory responses, which ones are appropriate and which ones are not. It's part of how we look at the world. We, of course, view the world through the lens of the Internet, and so we think about the connected and the unconnected. And you're quite correct, actually, that there are a lot of places that are not very well connected. So I come from Canada, and we have vast chunks of the country that are well connected, and other vast chunks that are quite badly connected. We were just at an Indigenous Connectivity Summit in the very far north of Canada, where connectivity is fairly poor. That's true in this region as well, right? We have places that have, as I was saying before, very good connectivity, like where we are sitting right now, and we have other parts where connectivity could really use some help. And that's why we work on community networks, and also on IXPs, on Internet exchange points, and other kinds of efforts in order to figure out different ways to make connectivity a reality for all of the population. I think it's clear that we've got a lot of differences in regulatory frameworks. We have, socio and cultural differences between different parts of the world, and so you're going to have different regulatory frameworks. Obviously, for instance, the European Union has come up with this general data protection regulation, and that has had effects all around the world. One of the things that we have been working on at the Internet Society is the unintended consequences of extraterritorial application of regulations. So the GDPR is the example that everybody thinks of right now, but there are a lot of these actually, where a regulation in one part of the world affects everybody on the Internet, and it affects things in an uneven way, and this has unintended consequences. We, of course, are not a government. We don't have positions about precisely what people ought to do, but we want people to understand what the consequences are of their regulations. The Internet of Things is kind of a slogan, right? It's a very large term for a vast range of different kinds of options. So some of them are quite, they require a large degree of connectivity, and those are devices that are literally talking on the Internet themselves. And others are really sensor networks and so on that don't talk directly to the Internet, but rather talk to a gateway, which itself is then connected to the Internet. And dealing with both of those under the same slogan is sometimes confusing. So that's part of the reason that it seems like a jargon. The thing that is true is that what we've seen is that the internet tends to encourage connections, right? That a lot of things get connected to the internet, and those things get connected to the internet because there's some value that you get from it. You can do something that you couldn't otherwise do. So in the case of the Internet of Things, what you can do, for instance, the simple cases that we see now, you can control your thermostat while you're out of the house and so on. Obviously, that's valuable. But over time, what we will see is that the value of the networking allows things to work together that otherwise couldn't have. You know, imagine a system where you have the smart grid, for instance, that allows the electrical grid to add or remove power or redistribute it in a green way, thereby permitting a more efficient use of the power. That's an obvious advantage, and the power of the internet gives us that power to use things more efficiently. That's an example of one of the things I think we're going to see. Our particular interest in the Internet of Things at the Internet Society right now, we're focused on consumer devices. And the reason we're focused on that is because of the security of these devices. Historically, security on the internet has been not always added at the design phase. People try to add it later, and it's quite difficult to add security to a device later. So what we're trying to do is encourage manufacturers to think about those design decisions while they're in the manufacturing phase in order to reduce the risk that comes from consumer devices and the Internet of Things. One thing that we have to remember is that every technology that you can think of has negative consequences, has ways that people can use that technology that is maybe contrary to humankind. So for instance, I live in Toronto, and a few months ago we had a man who drove on the sidewalk with a white van, and he ran down pedestrians. Does this mean that we should ban white vans? No, probably not. They're useful, you can do things with them, you can move your furniture, and so this is an example of something where we see people you know, behaving outside the positive effects of the technology. So we do see that sometimes with the internet, and there are people who are using the internet for negative consequences. But what we have to do is make the resilience of the network greater and use the private innovation that we've seen that made all of these tremendous inventions available to us. We need to use that in order to respond to these kinds of mechanisms. Sometimes we hear governments, for instance, suggesting, oh, well, we'll do this with a treaty or with regulation and the like. And I think that there are places for regulation, but I'm not personally convinced that a treaty is going to be adequately fast to respond to the challenges. The attackers move faster than governments generally can, especially in an international negotiation context. So I think we need to use the innovation that we've seen traditionally on the internet to try to respond to these negative consequences. It can be a challenge. I think that governments understand that there's a lot of value in the internet. I think that they appreciate that this is a technology that has improved the lives of a lot of people in a lot of different ways, and they don't want to destroy it. I think, however, that sometimes they have a picture of the way the internet functions that is not quite correct, that sometimes they think of it as a centrally controllable network. And the internet, because it's a network of networks, it's right there in the word, it doesn't work that way. There's no center of control on the internet because in a network of networks there's no center. So you can't control it from the center, and you have to figure out how to do distributed management of the system. And that's the tricky part. It's very difficult for governments to think that way. Well, the first thing that I would say is people who are predicting how the internet is going to evolve over the next 10 years are probably selling you snake oil. I know that 10 years ago, I never would have believed some of the things that we see today on the internet that are just completely ubiquitous. So one thing that I would say is be very cautious of futurists selling visions of the internet. The internet is, we're very early in the evolution of this technology. We've barely begun to understand its potential. And I think that that's an important important reality. But that's part of the reason that the Internet Society is an Internet society and not, some sort of bossy pants controller. We are working together with all of our communities. We have chapters all over the world. We have members all over the world. We have organizational members all over the world. And these are the community of communities that allows us to understand the way that the internet is expressing itself in these various places. And that's actually how we can work together, how this network of people can work together to understand how the network of technology can benefit us all.